Let's look at our I can statement. I can share my thinking about this story. Today, we're going to be a communicator. Here are the different ways we're going to be communicating. I can talk with my friends to help me to understand the story better. I listen and ask questions so I can understand. I speak so others can understand me. I write to share my ideas. You are going to be sharing your thinking about a story. Are you ready to see the story you're going to be looking at? I'm so excited to share this with you. This story is called The Mitten, and it's written by Jan Brett. At this time, go ahead and pause the video to listen to The Mitten. All right, we've looked at the story together. Now, let's go ahead and see what part of Jacob's ladder we're going to be doing together. Are you ready, readers? Okay, so we listened to The Mitten. And I remember in this story, there were many different animals that went to hide inside of a mitten. Do you remember what happened first, then, next, after that, and last? These are some important words. Today, we're going to be looking at sequencing. When you sequence a story, you put the events in order. For example, what happened first? Think back to the story. Do you remember which animal went inside of the mitten first? We're going to be talking about that in just a moment because we're practicing sequencing today. Let's go ahead and we are going to be thinking back at the story, The Mitten. Do you remember it? Okay, so today, readers, we're going to be practicing sequencing. We've worked on sequencing before. In sequencing, you put events in order. For example, what happens first, next, then, after that, and last. Look at this picture. We can notice the seeds. First, we have the seeds. Then, after the seeds are planted, the tree starts to grow. Notice all the fruit on the tree now. Last, we have a delicious piece of fruit to eat. We can see what happens first, next, then, after that, and last in this sequencing example. Let's go ahead and think back to the story, The Mitten. Let's think about this story for a moment because we are going to be sequencing it. So in this story, let's sequence what happened after Nicky dropped his mitten. Do you remember this? Nicky dropped his mitten. Let's sequence the story. Now remember, good readers always go back and look at the books. So we are going to be looking back at the story to help us. Let's think for a moment. What happened next? Here's the mitten. I wonder what happened after the mitten was dropped. Do you remember? Pause the video and share some ideas. What happened first? What can you think of? What happened first? Do you know? Well, let's look back at the story because that's what good readers do. So I remember in the story, that in the mitten, I remember Nicky. Remember the boy Nicky? Do you remember when his grandmother was making mittens and she knitted some for him? Do you remember they were snow white? Do you remember? Very white. And I remember this part. Readers, look back here. Do you see here? What happened here? Think about it. That's right. The mitten dropped. Remember when Nicky was outside and he dropped the mitten? Now, here's a clue as to what happens next. Do you remember here? The mitten was dropped. I wonder what animal this is. Do you know? I wonder. It was a mole. Do you remember this part? Look. What happened with the mole? You're right. The mole went inside of the mitten. So we could say for here, what happened next? The mitten dropped and the mole went inside of the mitten. We could say that. So if we look at these pictures, what got in the mitten? What do you think got in the mitten? Well, we looked back at the story. Do you remember when we noticed that it was a mole? Here's the mole. Do you see the picture? So we could say, what got in first? Remember when we looked back at the story and the mole got in first? Here's the mole. We could say the mole got in first. Well, what got in next? Let's look at the pictures. I see an owl. I see the mole, but we already got the mole here. I see a bear and the rabbit. What do you think? Let's look back at the story. Okay, so here is the part. Remember right here when the mole went inside of the mitten? And here's a clue. Who do you see in the clue here? Do you see that picture? Let's look back at this part next. Look! Do you see? It was a snowshoe rabbit. Do you remember this? And the mole was already in the mitten. And now look, the snowshoe rabbit is going in the mitten. So you know what? We could say first the mole went in the mitten, and then next the snowshoe rabbit went in the mitten. Because we're sequencing the story. We're finding out the order. I wonder what got in the mitten after the snowshoe rabbit. So many pictures. I wonder, do you remember? Well, let's see. We have the mole, the snowshoe rabbit, and I wonder if it's the mouse, the owl, or the hedgehog. Look back. What do you think? Well, let's look back at the book. So here's the mole and the snowshoe rabbit, and here's a clue. What animal do you see for the clue? Let's go ahead and look. The hedgehog. You're right. Look, remember how the mole was there and then the snowshoe rabbit, and now the hedgehog is going in the mitten. I see a clue. Who's going in the mitten after the hedgehog? Put your microphone button on and share. What animal is this? Do you know? You're right. It is an owl. Do you remember this part? So if we look back here, we already said the mole, then the snowshoe rabbit, and then we could do the owl, and then or is it oh, it's the hedgehog, and then the owl. You're right. Hedgehog first, then the owl. Because we're sequencing the story. We're putting the story in order. Now, I wonder who got in next. Who do you think got in next? Look at the pictures at the top. Who do you think got in next? Well, you know what, readers? We look back at the story and the book to see. And I see here, do you notice the clue? I see that clue. Oh, and you know what? It's the badger. Those of you who said badger, you're right. Go ahead and kiss your brain. It is the badger. And then look at the clue. The badger. And then the fox. You remember? And then this part surprised me. Do you remember the big animal at the end? Which one was it? Do you remember? You're right, the bear. I couldn't believe it when the bear was trying to get in. Do you remember that part? So you know what? If we look back at this, we could say, didn't the badger go in and then the fox? Right? And then I wonder who got in next. We look at the pictures that are left over. Do you see? Oh, we were just at this part. Do you remember in the book? Let's look back, readers. Right here. Remember the fox went in and then it was the big animal. And remember I said that I was surprised. This was the big animal. What was this big animal that went in last? Oh, you're right. It's not the last animal, but the big one. What was the big one? The bear. And then remember the bear is going in. This one then went in. What was that? The mouse. Yeah, that was the meadow mouse. And remember all of the animals were in the mitten? So when we were sequencing this, after the fox part, we could say that what went in next? Was it the grandmother here? Is it the mouse or is it the bear? You're right. The part I was surprised with the big animals, so the bear, and then last was the mouse. You're right. Oh, excellent job, readers. Let's look back at our I can statement. I can share my thinking about the story. And we were looking at the story, The Mitten, and we were using Jacob's ladder. And today we were working on sequencing.